Right now, Iran is dominating every headline on earth. Strikes, nuclear standoffs, regime upheaval, the death of its supreme leader, a new name in power. The whole world is watching a nation that most people think they understand, but almost nobody truly does. Because here is the detail almost every news anchor, every analyst, every diplomat quietly skips over. The country they are calling Iran? It wasn't always called that. For over 2,500 years, the whole world knew it by a different name. A name that carries empires, prophecies, golden thrones, and the fingerprints of God himself across its letters. A name that was changed, deliberately, quietly, with enormous political consequence, in a single moment in 1935. And the reason it was changed? Almost nobody dares tell you the full story. The name was Persia. And once you understand why it was swapped for Iran, and by whose influence, the events unfolding on your screen today will never look the same again. Stay with me until the very end, because this is the story they left out of the history books. It begins not in a diplomat's office in 1935, but in the ancient soil of a civilization older than memory itself. Part 1. The name the world used for 2,500 years. Close your eyes for a moment and think of the word Persia. What comes to mind? Magnificent carpets, the scent of saffron and rose, towering columns at Persepolis, Cyrus the Great astride an empire that stretched from the edges of India to the shores of Egypt, Daniel in a foreign court, reading the handwriting on a palace wall, wise men reading stars and traveling west to find a king. Persia is not simply a geographic label. It is a civilizational memory. And for 2,500 years, it was the word the entire world used. The name itself traces back to a specific region in southwestern Iran, an area the ancient people called Parsa, what the Greeks rendered as Persis. When Cyrus the Great rose up from that region in the 6th century before Christ and built the Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, Greek historians began calling the entire kingdom after that founding province. The name spread. It entered Latin. It spread into Arabic, into European languages, into the vocabulary of diplomats, merchants, scholars, and prophets. Here is what makes this remarkable. The people who lived there never called it Persia at all. Internally, across thousands of years of literature, religion, and royal inscription, the people of this land called it Iran. They called themselves Iranians. The Zoroastrian sacred texts, the Avesta, some of the oldest religious writings in human history, used the word Aryanim to describe the homeland. The great Persian poet Ferdowsi, writing 1,000 years ago, celebrated Iran Zamin, the land of Iran. Even Cyrus the Great's own inscriptions refer not to Persia, but to a realm whose people understood themselves by a completely different name. So here is the extraordinary thing that has confused historians and confused the public for centuries. Persia was always an outsider's name. It was what the Greeks called them. It was what the Romans called them. It was what the Bible called them, and we will come to that. But it was not what they called themselves. The word Iran comes from a root far older and far deeper. It derives from the ancient term Aryanum, land of the Aryans. And those two words, Aryan and Iran, share the same ancient linguistic DNA. They are the same word, shaped differently by time. For millennia, that word carried a proud, noble meaning. It described the Indo-Iranian peoples who spread across Central Asia into the Iranian plateau and eastward into the Indian subcontinent. It was an ethnic, linguistic, and cultural marker, meaning noble or free or belonging to this great family of peoples. It was the name etched into a cliff face at Nakhshe-Rastam near Persepolis in the 3rd century AD, where the first Sasanian king described himself as the King of Kings of the Iranians. It was never a racial slur. It was never an ideology. It was simply the name a people gave to themselves and their land. But in 1935, something changed that ancient name forever, and it did not happen in a vacuum. Part 2. The man who renamed an empire. To understand what happened in 1935, you have to understand the man who made it happen. His name was Reza Shah Pahlavi. He had risen from almost nothing, a soldier in the Persian Cossack Brigade, to stage a coup in 1921, install himself as prime minister, and by 1925, crown himself Shah of Persia. He was a man of iron will and furious ambition. He looked at the nation he now ruled and saw humiliation written across its surface. For over a century, Persia had been carved up like a melon at a feast. The British controlled the oil. The Russians controlled the north. The 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention had literally divided the country into spheres of influence without asking a single Persian what they thought. Foreign powers had picked the bones of what was once the greatest empire on earth. Reza Shah burned with the need to change this. He built roads, railways, universities. He established the University of Tehran. He sent thousands of Iranian students to study in Europe and America. He looked at the modernizing world, and particularly at his neighbor and model, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, and decided that Persia needed to rebuild itself from the inside out. Part of that rebuilding was the question of identity, because for Reza Shah, the word Persia had become poisoned. It carried, in his own words, memories of weakness, ignorance, misery, fading independence, and the decadence of the Qajar dynasty that had let foreign powers run roughshod over the nation. Persia was the name the outsiders used. It was the name on the British oil company's letterhead, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which had taken complete control of Iran's petroleum industry and handed the profits to London. He despised it. So on March 21st, 1935, the Persian New Year, Nowruz, a deliberate and symbolic choice, Reza Shah issued a formal declaration to the international community. From that day forward, the country would be known as Iran. He requested foreign governments, diplomats, and press agencies to immediately update their correspondence. The stated reasoning was entirely defensible. Iran was the name the people themselves had always used. Persia was a Greek imposition. The renaming was a reclamation of authentic identity. It was, on one level, simply correcting an etymological mistake that had lasted 25 centuries. But there was another reason, and this is the part of the story that almost nobody tells you. Part 3. The Shadow Behind the Rename. In the early 1930s, Reza Shah Pahlavi was watching Europe with the attention of a man who understood power. And in Europe, one nation above all others was rising with terrifying speed. Germany. Adolf Hitler had come to power in 1933. The Third Reich was rebuilding its military, restructuring its economy, and constructing a racial ideology that placed one concept at its absolute center: the myth of Aryan supremacy. Nazi theorists had taken the ancient word Aryan, the very same ancient root that gave Iran its name, and weaponized it into a racial classification. In their telling, the Aryans were the master race, the builders of civilization, the pure-blooded ancestors of the Germanic people. This was historically dishonest and scientifically fraudulent, but it was enormously powerful as propaganda. And here is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. Nazi ideologues and German diplomats looked at Iran, at its ancient name Aryanum, at its inscriptions about the Aryans, at its Indo-European linguistic heritage, and said to Reza Shah, "You are one of us. Your people are not Semites, they are not Arabs, they are Aryans, they are racial kinsmen to the Germans." Reza Shah found this flattering in ways that cut very deep. He deeply resented being lumped in with the Arab world. Persians are not Arabs, they speak Farsi, a completely separate Indo-European language, and they have a distinct civilization stretching back 3 millennia. He equally resented the condescension of British and Russian powers. And here was Germany, the rising power of Europe, the nation shaking the world, telling him that his people were the equal of any European bloodline. By the mid-1930s, Germany had become Iran's single largest trading partner. German engineers were building Iran's Trans-Iranian Railway. German advisors were reorganizing the Iranian military. German archaeologists were excavating Persepolis and publishing work that emphasized the Aryan roots of Persian civilization. The Nazi Party even established a chapter in Tehran. Multiple historians and scholars have documented what happened next. According to records, the German ambassador in Tehran and several Nazi-aligned academics conveyed a suggestion to Reza Shah. Why do you still let the Western world call you by a Greek name? That name, Persia, was imposed on your ancestors by foreigners. Embrace your true name, Iran. Emphasize that your civilization is the original Aryan homeland. Announce it to the world. Reza Shah agreed. and on March 21, 1935, the announcement was made. Germany responded swiftly. The Nazi government amended its own racial laws, the Nuremberg Laws, to formally classify Iranians as Aryan, placing them outside the racial restrictions applied to Jewish and other peoples. Hitler sent a congratulatory letter to Reza Shah when Iran completed its new railway. The alignment between Tehran and Berlin deepened. Now, and this is critical, not every historian agrees on the extent of Germany's influence on the name change. Some scholars argue that the internal desire to reclaim the indigenous name was the primary driver, and that the Nazi connection is overstated. They point out that the name Iran had been used in Persian literature and Zoroastrian scripture for thousands of years, that the word had appeared in official documents long before Hitler existed, and that Reza Shah's reforms were far more aligned with Ataturk's secular nationalism than with Nazi racial ideology. They note that he was the first Iranian monarch in over 1,000 years to publicly honor the Jewish faith, bowing before the Torah during a visit to Isfahan's Jewish community. Both things can be true simultaneously. The name Iran is genuinely ancient, and genuinely the name the Iranian people used for themselves. And the 1935 proclamation also happened within a specific geopolitical context, at a moment when Nazi racial theorists were providing ideological validation that Reza Shah found useful. History rarely has clean motives. What is certain is this: when news of the rename reached London, Winston Churchill himself asked Tehran to temporarily revert to Persia for the duration of World War II. His concern? Iran and Iraq sounded too similar, and British troops needed clarity in the field. Tehran declined. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran anyway, not over the name, but because Reza Shah was harboring thousands of German advisors and engineers they feared were intelligence operatives for the Third Reich. Reza Shah was deposed and sent into exile. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, took the throne. By 1959, the new Shah softened the policy, announcing that both Persia and Iran could be used interchangeably in formal correspondence. But Iran had already taken hold. The world had adjusted, and when the Islamic Revolution swept everything away in 1979 and the country became the Islamic Republic of Iran, the name was locked in permanently. Persia was not officially dead, but it had been quietly removed from power. Part 4. What disappeared with the name? Here is something that almost no one stops to consider. When a nation renames itself, it is not just changing letters on a map, it is rewriting what people remember. Think about what lives inside the word Persia that does not automatically travel with the word Iran. Persia carries Cyrus the Great, the king the Bible calls the Lord's anointed, the pagan monarch who freed the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity and funded the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. When you say Persia, you are invoking that specific history, that specific alignment with the purposes of God. Persia carries Daniel's visions, the two-armed silver figure in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the bear with 3 ribs, the ram charging west, north, and south, unstoppable until suddenly an extraordinary force from the west struck it down. The entire prophetic architecture of the Book of Daniel is constructed around Persia as the empire God raised to replace Babylon. Persia carries Esther and Mordecai, the story of a hidden Jewish queen in the palace at Susa, the capital city at the heart of what we now call southwestern Iran, who risked her life to prevent the genocide of her people. The villain Haman was hanged on the very gallows he built for others. The day of Israel's intended annihilation became instead a day of rescue. Persia carries the Magi, those learned men from the East, almost certainly from the ancient Medo-Persian tradition of astronomical and prophetic scholarship, men who understood the writings of Daniel well enough to recognize when his prophecies of the Messiah were being fulfilled, who followed a star and arrived in Bethlehem with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The first worshippers of the Messiah from outside the Jewish world came from the soil of modern-day Iran. All of that memory is stored in the word Persia, and today, when you watch the news and see Iran, almost none of that memory travels with the word. Iran carries nuclear programs, proxy wars, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, hostage crises, Hezbollah, and chants of death to America and death to Israel. That is what is accumulated around the word Iran in the public imagination. This is not merely a language problem, it is a perception problem, and perception shapes how we read prophecy. Because the nation the world is watching right now, the nation that just experienced US and Israeli strikes on its nuclear facilities, the nation whose supreme leader was killed in those strikes, the nation that is now fracturing at its edges amid the largest protests since 1979, that nation is still Persia. It is still the land of Elam and Media. It is still the civilization named in the books of Daniel, Ezekiel, Esther, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. The name changed. The land did not. The people did not. And most critically, the prophecies did not. Part 5. The prophecy that uses both names. Now here is where this story goes somewhere that will shake you. The book of Ezekiel, written roughly 2,600 years ago, contains one of the most debated passages in all prophetic scripture. Chapter 38 describes a massive coalition of nations that will rise against a restored Israel in the last days. God speaks directly to a figure called Gog, a prince or leader from a land called Magog, telling him that he and his coalition will come against God's people like a storm, like a cloud covering the land. And among the nations named in that coalition, among the very first listed, is Persia. Not Iran, Persia. Because Ezekiel used the name of his day, and the nation he named is the exact same geographical territory, the exact same people, now called by a different name, the same nation that once freed Israel, the same nation that funded the temple, the same nation from which the wise men came. That nation is described in Ezekiel 38 as joining a northern coalition, widely understood by scholars to include a major power from the far north, generally identified with Russia, in a military campaign against Israel that will provoke the direct intervention of God himself. Earthquakes, fire, confusion among the armies, divine judgment falling on those who rose against his people. Now look at what is happening in 2026. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure and military leadership in late February. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed in those strikes. His son Mujtaba Khamenei has assumed leadership. NATO was almost drawn in after Iranian ballistic missiles were intercepted in Turkish airspace. Protests erupted across Iran in late 2025, potentially the largest since the Islamic Revolution itself. The regime is fracturing. And here is the prophetic echo that demands your full attention. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in the 7th century before Christ, received a specific word about Elam, the ancient name for a core region of southwestern Iran, the very heartland of what became the Persian Empire. God said through Jeremiah, "I will shatter the bow of Elam, the backbone of its military strength." The bow in the ancient world was the primary instrument of warfare. It was the symbol of a nation's offensive power. And scholars who study this passage in the light of current events point out that Iran's ballistic missile program, precisely the weapons struck in 2025 and 2026, was Iran's single greatest military threat, its bow, its backbone. But Jeremiah did not stop at judgment. He went further. He said, "In the last days I will restore the captives of Elam," declares the Lord. The judgment and the restoration, the shattering of the bow, and then, beyond it, a promise of return. This is the part of Iran's story that the news anchors will not tell you. Not because they are hiding it, but because they do not know it exists. When they say Iran, they mean the geopolitical actor. They mean the Islamic Republic. They mean the regime. They do not mean the ancient land of Elam, the nation woven across 6 books of the Bible, the civilization that stands at the intersection of every major prophetic timeline. But it is the same place. People caught between the names. Something else is happening right now that deserves your attention. Across social media, across the Iranian diaspora, across conversations in Tehran itself, a quiet but significant shift is underway. People are increasingly refusing the name Iran when they mean the regime. They are reaching back past the Islamic Republic, past Reza Shah's 1935 decree, past the geopolitics and the ideology, and they are picking up the ancient name. They are calling it Persia. When Iranian dissidents and their supporters reach for that name, they are not proposing a bureaucratic rebrand. They are reaching behind the Islamic Republic to a deeper civilizational identity. They are saying, This regime is not the beginning. It is not the whole story. There is something older here, something the mullahs did not create and cannot own. And that something has a name: Persia. Names carry legitimacy. When a regime can define what its nation is called, it controls the origin story. It controls the inheritance. It shapes what memory is possible. And when people start refusing that name, when they reach back for an older word, they are quietly performing an act of civilizational defiance. They are saying, "You are not the beginning, and you will not be the end." This is not merely symbolic. In the context of biblical prophecy, it is deeply significant. Because the prophecies of Scripture do not align with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They align with Persia, with the land, with the people, with the civilization. The republic can fall, the regime can fracture. The Islamic revolutionary system that has ruled since 1979 can collapse entirely, and the prophecies will still apply. Because they were not written about governments, they were written about a people and a land. And that land is Elam. It is Media. It is Persia. It is what the world has called Iran since 1935. All of it is the same place. And all of it is in the Bible. Part 7. The Arc that Bends Toward Restoration. Let me bring together the full arc, because this is what almost nobody sees when they look at Iran in the headlines. It begins in Genesis. Two descendants of Noah, Elam, son of Shem, and Madai, son of Japheth, settle in the highland terrain of what we now call Iran. Their descendants grow into powerful peoples. Elam becomes aggressive enough to wage the Bible's first recorded international war, capturing Lot and triggering Abraham's miraculous night rescue with only 318 trained servants. Madai's descendants eventually unite with Elam's to form what history calls the Median Empire. Then comes the prophecy. Isaiah, writing 150 years before the events, names a man called Cyrus as God's anointed instrument, a pagan Persian king who will free Israel from Babylonian captivity. The name is spoken before the man is born, and it happens exactly as spoken. Daniel, a Jewish teenager exiled in Babylon, watches it all unfold. He sees the Silver Empire in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and correctly identifies the two arms as Medo-Persia. He sees the bear raised up on one side, Persia dominant over Media, with three ribs representing the great conquests: Lydia, Babylon, Egypt. He sees the ram charging west, north, and south. He watches Cyrus enter Babylon along a dry riverbed on the very night the writing appeared on the palace wall. Persia does not destroy Israel, it rebuilds it. Zerubbabel and Joshua return with the king's blessing and his resources. The temple foundations are laid. And in Susa, in the ancient capital of Elam, in the heart of what is today southwestern Iran, the Book of Esther unfolds. A Jewish orphan named Hadassah, renamed Esther, becomes queen of the greatest empire on earth and uses that position to stop a genocide. Then come the Magi, scholars from the East, almost certainly heirs to the Medo-Persian tradition of prophetic and astronomical study, men who almost certainly knew the writings of Daniel. When the star appears, they recognize it instantly. They travel hundreds of miles. They arrive at a manger in Bethlehem and bow before a child. They bring gold, declaring his kingship, frankincense, recognizing his divinity, myrrh, foreshadowing his death. The first worshippers of the Messiah from outside the Jewish world come from Persia. Then the silence. Centuries pass. Rome takes center stage. Persia retreats from the biblical narrative, but not from history. And then, in the final movement of the prophetic arc, Persia re-enters, not as a redeemer, not as a liberator, but as a nation in a coalition, listed by Ezekiel alongside Gog and Magog, rising against the very people it once helped rebuild. The same land, a different posture, rising at the wrong moment, in the wrong alliance, against the wrong target, and God himself responds. But even here, even in judgment, the story is not over. Because Jeremiah's word about Elam contains that extraordinary promise, "In the last days, I will restore the captives of Elam." The door is left open, even for those who rose against God's purposes, even for the nation that was once a redeemer and became a foe. The arc of Scripture bends toward restoration for those who turn. This is the full arc, and it is the arc of Iran. Whether the world calls it Persia or Iran, whether it was renamed in 1935 for reasons of proud nationalism or geopolitical alignment with a German dictator, Whether its current regime falls or transforms, the land remains. The people remain. And the prophecies that were written about that land by prophets, who called it Elam, Madai, and Persia, those prophecies remain. Part 8. Why no one talks about it. So why doesn't anyone talk about it? Part of the answer is simple. The name change worked. When you swap out a word that carries 2,500 years of civilizational memory and replace it with a different word, you create a break in the chain. People who know Iran do not automatically reach for their biblical literacy and pull out Cyrus, Esther, Daniel, and Ezekiel 38. The semantic distance is too great. The mental connection is broken. Part of the answer is uncomfortable. The link between the 1935 name change and Nazi Germany is one that nobody's side wants to fully own. Secular Iranian nationalists want to honor Reza Shah's modernizing legacy without dwelling on his admiration for Hitler. The Iranian diaspora who prefer the name Persia want to reclaim cultural glory without associating the beloved ancient name with a political maneuver shaped by racial ideology. Western commentators discussing the rename find themselves navigating a conversation that makes everyone awkward. And part of the answer is spiritual. The full story of Iran in biblical prophecy requires accepting that the same nation can be both redeemer and adversary, both instrument of God and object of judgment, both the civilization from which wise men worshiped the Messiah and the land named in Ezekiel's most terrifying coalition. That kind of complexity is harder to package into a news segment or a social media post. But complexity is where the truth lives. And right now, in 2026, the truth matters more than it has in decades. Because the strikes have happened. The leader is dead. The protests are spreading. The regime is fracturing. And a civilization of 92 million people, ancient Persia, modern Iran, biblical Elam and media, stands at what may be its most pivotal crossroads in 2,500 years. What comes next for that land will be shaped by forces that are political, military, economic, and prophetic all at once. And you cannot understand any of it, not fully, not truly, if you only use the name that was chosen in 1935. You have to know the name it carried before that. The name the Bible used. The name etched in cliff faces by ancient kings. The name that was not imposed from outside, but carried from within across 3,000 years of history. You have to know Persia. Closing. From Genesis to Revelation, from the highlands where Elam and Madai first settled, to the visions of Ezekiel's last days coalition, this land has never been outside the plan. It was there when Abraham pursued the kings of the east. It was there when Daniel read the handwriting on the wall. It was there when Cyrus the Great opened the gates of Babylon without a battle. It was there when Esther stood before the king without being summoned. It was there when the wise men followed the star. It was there in Ezekiel's darkest vision. And according to Jeremiah, it will be there at the restoration. The name on the map changed in 1935. The story written in eternity did not. So I want to ask you, now that you know the full picture, do you see what is happening in today's headlines differently? Do you see ancient Persia in the nation the news anchors call Iran? Do you see the prophecies moving in what the world calls geopolitics? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what you see. And if this kind of deep historical and prophetic exploration is something you want more of, if you want to understand what the Bible actually says about the world we are living in, then like this video and share it. Every share means another person gets the full picture instead of just the headlines. And if you are ready to go even deeper, click right now on the video appearing on your screen. We are going into the book of Daniel, the prophecies that named Cyrus before his birth, the visions that mapped thousands of years of human history, and the signs that tell us where we are on that map right now. You do not want to miss it. Blessings.